Madison, thank you for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me, Brienne.
You are quite welcome. I am excited to talk to you. I think you joined my Facebook group and I just loved what you had to say. So I got really curious on exactly who you are and what you do, which led to this conversation. Before you get any further, I'm just going to have you dive in and answer, who are you?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Madison Doubroff. I am based out of California, Los Angeles area. And I've been a functional movement coach and corrective exercise specialist for the last 12 years and some change. I work online. I have a team of physical therapists and orthopedic movement specialists and functional health coaches. And we basically work to help bridge the gap from recurring and chronic injuries and sorenesses and pains and all that good stuff that people often deal with, especially those of us that love to stay active. And we want to move them not only out of that injury or out of that pain, but advance them back to whatever activities that they love, whether that's running, whether that is going for long hikes, or whether that's playing with the kids in the yard, or whatever it is that, or CrossFit workouts, whatever they want to do. We want to make sure that we're getting their body prepared to that level. So we take a holistic approach with it. And it's something that benefited me personally with my own journey. I was an athlete that dealt with a ton of chronic pains and a lot of very varieties of injuries to the ankles that were a good one. Achilles heel, no pun intended, with tons and tons of sprains and massive tears. Both knees got like meniscus, ACL, MCL injuries between the two of them. Lower back sciatica was probably one of the bigger of the issues for a number of years, and even like neck and shoulder and all kinds of stuff. So I kind of went through the gambit, and it impacted my career as a football player. And I then got into this kind of whole holistic rehabilitation process and loved it, and pivoted my career and never looked back.
Awesome. And that's what I really want to dive into, is kind of your story. Like, you created what you have today because of like what you learned in your past. What did that past process look like as far as surgeries or therapy or all the failed attempts of who knows what?
Yeah, sure. So for me, there was basically 8 straight years of with playing competitive football, that I was dealing with normally 1 to 2 pretty significant injuries. Several of them knocked me out for months on end from playing, but a lot of times they were serious enough, like a brutal sprained ankle. It was serious enough to really impact me, but I could duct tape that thing up enough that I could like hobble around the field and grit my teeth a bit. Take far too much, way too much ibuprofen. I was popping that like candy at the time. But I like my kind of journey personally was often start the season feeling amazing, did all this off-season training, feeling really strong, feeling stable, $1,000,000, and within like 3 weeks or less, something would give. A hamstring would tear, my back would go out, my knee would get sprained, whatever. And then the remainder of the next several months of the season, I just felt like a shell of myself. Like I would perform at like what felt like 70-80% of my capacity at best. Constantly living in physical therapy and athletic trainers' offices, just rehabbing my body. I was just chasing symptoms left and right, and doing ankle specific, knee specific, back specific, hips, whatever was hurt. It was that specific rehab that was done. And then I'd get out of that season, it would take me a month or 2 to feel like I was becoming more normal again. And then more often than not, my off seasons went pretty well. Like I wasn't training like an idiot. I listened to my body. I worked on a lot of important like range of motion. Like I did like general stretching and that kind of stuff. I wasn't a complete meathead, although tempted to be that way. and I would feel really good. And then the next year would come around and rinse and repeat that process. And so like I said, I lived through the rehabilitation. Like I spent more time in physical therapy and athletic trainers' offices than I did in the gym. And I got really comfortable with rehabbing my body. And then, yeah, I got out of it because I stopped playing just because I one of the main reasons was I was just sick of being in pain. I was sick of hurting. I couldn't. I was in my early 20s and couldn't live a normal life. Like sitting in a car for more than 20 minutes, my sciatic nerve would go on fire, or like nothing like being like 21 years old and throwing out your back, picking up some laundry and crawling up the stairs and being in back spasms and stuff like that. It just didn't make sense. And I was naturally kind of getting into the fitness industry. That was kind of as I was transitioning out of it. And I was finding that I was working with a lot of other individuals dealing with injuries and recurring pains. And I felt really comfortable working with them because I knew what to do and what not to do with them, since I kind of lived in physical therapy. And then that kind of just things fell into place where I was like, oh, there's this whole thing of being like a corrective exercise specialist, and you can work on functional movement and take more of a holistic view at teaching the whole body how to move correctly. Like no one ever taught me how to walk, let alone run. Like I had no idea what proper mechanics were supposed to be. So my body, even if as in the best shape of my life, my body kind of moved like crap, and I had all kinds of asymmetries. So correcting that was what was the game changer for me, and what caused me to like get into the industry that I am now.
Without going into specific details, since like saying exactly what you did for every single issue would be difficult to do, like what was the difference between going to therapy, doing those exercises to treat specifically the symptoms, and the type of exercises you were doing that actually got you to where you are now?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that kind of the across the board, no matter what the injury was, the kind of protocols around it were first a whole lot of stim and ice. Let's get that stim and ice going like crazy, and nobody's business. Depending on the therapist I was working with or athletic trainer I was working with, there was a lot of passive range of motion and manual manipulation that was done around the area. Never really explored above and below it. Like if I hurt my knee, we were working on knee range of motion. We weren't looking at my ankle range of motion or hip range of motion to see maybe why that knee was pissed off in the first place. So it was always very local in terms of any kind of range of motion or manipulation that was done. And then exercise wise was like the gambit of things that are needed. Like I think that if you just injured yourself, then yeah, you need to do like some passive or easy like knee extensions, or you need to do some basic bridges or clamshells or whatever, like all of our kind of typical ankle circles, or draw the ABCs with that. Like all those things are needed. Single leg balance or stand on an Eric's pad or whatever. But it was never beyond that, or I should say very rarely beyond that. Every once in a while I would have a therapist that I was working with, a physio, that would have me be doing like you would almost go from like super basic, go from like barely standing on one leg to like the next time you see him, you're doing like squat to medicine ball throws. There was like very little bridging the gap of like, all right, now you can stand on one leg. Let's teach you how to make that a little more dynamic, or let's teach you how to squat better, or lunge better, hip hint. It was like 0 to 60 if there was any kind of progression from there. And like at that point, it was just like I didn't get a lot of specific cues on what I should be doing correctly or what I should do differently or whatever. It was just kind of like squat and throw that ball against the wall as hard as you can, and let's see if you can do it. And if that thing hurts, and if it doesn't hurt, cool, we're good to go. So that was kind of my experience. It was hyper focused treatments, a lot of the basic exercises or range of motion techniques. And then every once in a while, someone would be like, "Oh, you're a football player. Okay, well, like all right, now you can extend your knee and flex your knee to a certain degree. So box jumps, it was like, okay, cool. So it was way extreme on one end or the other.
Excuse me. And then going to more the corrective exercise type stuff, like what did you start doing or maybe experimenting with on yourself that you started noticing like things are actually improving now?
Oh yeah, sorry. I think you already asked that. You
All
asked me
good.
to
All
bridge
good.
that gap. Yeah. So the difference in terms of kind of a more holistic and movement-based rehabilitation process that led to performance was not just like looking at the localized area, but taking a really good picture of how the body moves in like all planes of motion and all of its various patterns. So like sometimes like we get like the squat is something that we look at and initially see like, all right, what's their depth and how symmetrical is their body, or what's their lumbar position in while they're doing, like we take a look at a number of different things in that squat pattern, but that's one movement pattern of many that we do each day. We also lunge, and we lunge in multiple planes of motion. We hip hinge, and we hip hinge on one or both legs. We have different positions of our legs when we are squatting. And then we also have this whole upper body where we're doing rotations and reaches, like overhead work. And like, there's all kinds of different other movements that we do on a regular basis. So if we take a look at all of them and see, all right, well, when they are lunging, or like maybe when they squat, they look okay. But if they lunge, if they get unilateral with one leg versus the other, that's when their body goes to whack, like goes all wacky. Well, okay, that means that we have a single-sided imbalance there. So then let's take a look at their ranges of motion. What's going on? Why is that occurring? Is it from their ankles? Is there one ankle that's doing something different than the other? Is it from their hips? And the hips move in multiple ranges of motion. So let's look at that in different positions. Is it their thoracic spine, their shoulder girdle? What's going on that's kind of impacting that gluten core complex, those big important muscle groups that stabilize us when they're in that staggered stance or whatever the position is. And once for me, I figured out like my right ankle was totally different than my left ankle. It was way like that was the ankle that I did more damage to than the left. So it was just a bunch of scar tissue that limited its range of motion. I had a significant difference in my hip flexion and extension versus hip internal and external rotation. Like they were total opposites. My thoracic spine was also asymmetrical. I couldn't rotate very well to the left, but I could rotate great to the right. Like I was limited all over the place from one side to the other. So as I did the right mobility work to the areas a little bit every day, like one day working on the ankles, one day working on the hips, one day working on the thoracic spine, and just kind of chipping away at getting my body more back to symmetry, at least on its ranges of motion. That allowed me to build the foundation that I could then start to like work on those lunges and get them balanced again. And that's when it's like learning how you should lunge, like where should that knee be, how should your hip be positioned, where should you feel this, like what should be working right now, and what should be burning out and tiring out. Like those kinds of things are invaluable for me because now I knew what to pay attention to. And with the range of motion back to where it needed to, I was actually able to do the things correctly and feel it the way that I should. Oh yeah, I do feel that right butt burning out, and I do feel that back left hip flexor opening up. Like I actually felt what I was supposed to. And by doing a more kind of holistic movement rehabilitation process, that got me back to like moving throughout my day really well. And that then allowed me to progress it a little bit more and get a little bit more challenging and start going more like single leg, single side stuff, working on more dynamic stability. And then that allowed me to actually do the fast twitch stuff that I mentioned earlier. Like I was able to do the squat to medicine ball throws and box jumps and and sprint and do all those fun things with having a body that was symmetrical and moving really well from each direction. And so like for the last 11, 12 years, I've been able to be a weekend warrior now. I'm not I wouldn't say competitive athlete, but I definitely enjoy playing some basketball and racquetball and going for runs with the dogs. And like, I'm not dealing with chronic pains anymore, skiing, all that good stuff.
I love that you mentioned the mobility aspect to it, because I think so often we get into, or like, people look for self-treatment, ways to self-treat, which I totally get it. But it just becomes like, oh, I need to strengthen my glutes and I need to do heel raises and I need to do all of this stuff, never looking at the facts, or never, you know, looking at to see, is my body even moving like it needs to be in order to actually like make these exercises work like they need to work.
Yeah. I can't, that to me is always, I shouldn't say always, but like with the clients that we work with, that's probably like 95% of the first things that we do with them. It doesn't have to be like only mobility work. It's not like they're not allowed to do any activities while they're doing mobility, but it's like, if you're going to spend 10 to 20 minutes a day, that's what I try to commit to on my body. That's what we try to ask our clients to commit to on their body, to like actually correct it or maintain it, something like to do some maintenance work and give it some love. Initially, like I couldn't agree with what you said enough, is that if you don't have the ability to move correctly because you have literal physical restrictions, you got fascia that's gunked up and tightened up, or you got old scar tissue, which technically is fascia, that's all gunked up or whatever, you have literal range of motion restrictions that are preventing you from moving well, then that's like your low hanging fruit. You got to restore, especially big asymmetries. Like let's get into those gunked up tissues and bust them up and break them up and get do some dynamic stretching if appropriate and blah blah blah. And let's get your range of motion back to where it needs to be. And that's what allows us to move correctly. So yeah, I couldn't agree with that more.
And I think it's also important to note, we're talking mobility, not stretching. Like, I think stretching is overrated personally. Like there's a time and place for certain things. There's a time and place for everything. But I think stretching is very overrated, just because we aren't really getting into the joint itself and figuring out, well, like, why that's limited. We're just essentially like stretching all the things around it that feel tight and hoping it works.
Yeah, I like. Brianna? Are you a fan of Katie Bowman?
I know I'm familiar with it, but I don't really do much with it.
So Katie Bowman is a biomechanist who has she's written a couple of books, like one's Move Your DNA, and I steal this illustration like from what you just talked about all the time, and she talks about stretching gunked up tightened tissue that has like fascial restrictions and all that kind of stuff in it versus pliable tissue. And she uses this example, and I'm like, this is beautiful, is that if you have normal gliding tissue that you want to do some stretching or dynamic stretching to and that kind of stuff, great, knock yourself out. That's like taking a cotton shirt or something and pulling on it, and it has a normal amount of elasticity that's distributed amongst that whole cotton shirt or whatever you're wearing. But if you have areas that have scar tissue or have like tissue restrictions because they haven't been hydrated very well, like you got this like real sticky tight stuff, then that's like taking swabs of paint and painting it on that shirt and letting that paint dry and then trying to pull on it. And now you have certain areas of fabric that are stuck together that aren't going to open up, versus other areas of that shirt are going to have to overstretch beyond they're even comfortable with. So you can stretch out your hamstrings all you want, but if you got like all this gunk throughout your hamstrings, then you're just going to overstretch certain parts of the hamstring, and the areas that are actually the causes of the tightness are never getting addressed. They're still gunked up and sticky. So I love that illustration, or that example, I should say, because it's like, yeah, if you just stretch, and most of us that are over the age of 10 have actual gunked up tissue that's preventing us from moving very well, then you're not getting the benefits of the stretching you think you are.
Yeah. Let's actually dive into that a little bit. Because I think so many times, I know I talk with people and it's like, oh, have you ever been injured in the past? Well, it was like when I was 15 years old, and just kind of, and it, I think we discount the stuff that happened years ago as being contributors to what could be going on now. So let's dive into that a little bit as far as like our injuries 10, 15, 20 years ago and how those impact how our bodies are moving today.
Yeah, so like there's that the whole thing of scar tissue. I think most of us that have had a significant injury have heard of that stuff. It's basically like when you significantly tear up tissue, your body's first response is to create its own cast. So what it does is it grows back this fascial web of tissue, but it grows it back in like random assortments, like a rat's nest that encompasses that damaged tissue. And that stuff we all like gets really bound up, but it's done on purpose. Like it's a defense mechanism to make sure we don't keep hurting that area any further, right? So that stuff, though, as it protects that joint or that tissue from getting hurt more, and over time that tissue or joint heals, is still left over. We still got this rat's nest that's all stuck around. And that causes us to kind of have this perpetual difference from one side or the other. And we learn to compensate. Like all of us know that when we hurt something, we got to compensate for a period of time. And it's really noticeable. Like you roll your ankle, you're hobbling around and limping, or if you're in crutches or that kind of thing. Like we've all gone through those things and felt the difference of like how one side atrophies or how we learn to have our pimp walk and that kind of stuff. Like we've all learned that that's a natural compensation, but we don't realize that when, or I shouldn't say we don't. Some people do. Some people finish it and they're like, I've finished rehabbing, and they're like, I still feel totally out of balance, and they just don't know why. But most of us don't realize that we still have imbalances that were left over. It's just subtle now. It's not so drastic. Like we have these little hip drops to one side, or we have one foot that turns out just a little bit further than the other. And then over the decades of 10,000 steps a day and death by 1,000 cuts, like we start to piss off either that area of the body or other areas that have been taken on more than they should start talking to us. The good leg all of a sudden becomes the problem child. And it's because of like how we've compensated or learned to compensate around these areas subconsciously. And then when you, to me, like I don't know about you, Brianne, but like from my perspective too, it's also the postures that we're in throughout the day, and we don't realize subconsciously that we have these single-sided tendencies over and over again. Is that something that you're dealing with on a regular basis?
Yeah, and I think that's the hardest part because like oh it's not something I dive into immediately with someone, but as someone's getting better and then kind of keeps like gets a plateau or starts getting some flare-ups, I start having that conversation of like really start paying attention to what you're doing in the middle, like during your day. And 9 times out of 10, I get the response of like, well, I'm not doing anything different or abnormal. And I think I mean, and to ourselves, we aren't like, it's the way we've learned to stand when we're washing dishes or when we're doing laundry or whatever. And so we don't think about that as being an issue. And so a lot of times it takes a deep conversation of diving in of just like, even if you have to film yourself all day, like what are you doing that's contributing to this issue still?
Yeah. Like I like to ask people like, what are you doing most consistently throughout your day? Like how much are you driving? Because a lot of times people don't even realize that they're doing something asymmetrical while they're driving. They got one foot that turned out totally toward the gas pedal. They got the other leg bent up near them. They're driving with one arm and leaning toward one armrest or the other. And like they're kinked there the whole time they're driving. They don't realize it. Or if they're at their office and working all day, like how do you sit? Are you sitting neutral, or do you sit with one leg crossed over or under the other? Do you have a monitor that's off to one side that you're always looking toward? Or however, if you're a mom, do you always pick up your kid and hold them on one hip versus the other? Or are you always holding one bag on one arm versus the other? Like there's so many things that we do. Even at the end of the day, like my wife and I, we talk about this all the time. Like we sit and we watch our TV at the end of the day, and we're always on one side of the couch versus the other. So you're always going to lean to that one
Mhm.
armrest. And so you create like an imbalance to one side. Uh, and then little things show up where you favor one leg, like you're bending forward to unload the dishwasher, it's always with that right leg in front, it's never with the other leg. Feels super goofy, but you wouldn't even realize that. Like we just tend to do things one-sided, and as we learn, oh yeah, this is what I always favor, if we start working towards the other side, it's feels goofy initially, but it starts to become more natural, and all of a sudden like that body doesn't ache so much because we're not torquing it over and over to one direction or the other.
Yeah, I have a really good example. A client of mine came to me with foot issues, like plantar fascia type symptoms. But I started looking at things. It's like there was some foot issues going on, but the opposite hip had some stuff, and we were clearing all that up. He was doing better, but still kept flaring himself up. Well, finally realized when he's standing at work, at home, anything, like he's on his right foot all the time.
Yeah.
So it was almost like he had created just like a bone bruise from constantly putting weight like all day on that part of the foot until he started being more attentive of it and shifting weight to the other side. Like that's when things really started clearing up for him. And so it is just these habitual things, and he's probably done that for decades, but it's those
Yeah.
habitual things that create a lot of our issues.
Yeah. And so many people like in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, we associate those like random issues as just like, it's coming with age. Like
Mhm.
I'm on the steady decline. I hit my 40s and now it's just time for the body to start wearing out. It's just a matter of time until I'm in that wheelchair. Like we just think of it that way. And as opposed to like, no, in reality, our joints and tissues are supposed to outlast us. They're supposed to feel good a heck of a lot longer than like our organs do. So if we take care of this thing, it's going to feel good for decades upon decades upon decades. But if we're not aware and we're doing repetitive patterns, even like you just said, just like standing on one leg versus the other over and over and over again for years on end, then it's going to create, it's like that death by a thousand cuts, just these subtle imbalances. And yeah, eventually something is going to give way, something's going to get impacted. But the beauty is that basically everybody has the ability to heal. You can relearn how to move correctly. Like you can reprogram that central nervous system. It takes some awareness. You got to be proactive about it. But like normally within like a few months, most people can chip away at 90% of their issues and get themselves in a really good place really quickly. So yeah, that's a great example.
And I think the tough thing with that too is, like you already mentioned a little bit ago, like our quote unquote normal movements get ingrained into our subconscious. So they feel totally normal. So then when we go to start correcting them, it feels totally wrong. It feels totally off. And our body and our brain are like, what are you doing to me right now? And then like it can be a really frustrating process, as like, I know I should be here, but this doesn't feel right. So I want to go back over here. And it's this like back and forth. I think it almost happens with your brain trying to figure out like where I'm supposed to be and why.
Yeah. And I think that's where like working with someone like yourself, or having a coach or a therapist that has their eyes on you and can confirm with you, like that's where that's invaluable. Like it's one thing to watch the instructions on like a YouTube or Facebook video and try to piecemeal it yourself, but it's another thing to have somebody look at you and say, yeah, that's exactly, you're moving perfectly, and then asking them questions like, is that like, do you feel this muscle working right now? You're not sure? Put your hand on your butt. See if that's working right now. Do you feel it tightening? Okay, good. That's exactly what we want to feel. Or do you feel that stretch there? Like that can help someone be like, okay, this might feel really awkward, but according to what Brienne's telling me, that's exactly what I'm supposed to be feeling right now. So that's what I got to practice and recreate every time I do this on my own each day. And then after a week or two, that thing doesn't feel quite so goofy. And after a month or two, that thing starts to feel natural and easy. And all of a sudden the body has adapted to it and learned how to move correctly. It just, those, like you said, those initial, like the initial 1, 2, 3 times that you practice, like trying to adjust walking gait. Like, oh my gosh, I laugh all the time when I get the descriptions from our clients when they first try to start adjusting their walking gait. Like they're like, I feel like I'm walking with the like stirrups between my knees, or I feel like I'm waddling everywhere, right? Like they're like, my head feels like it's moving side to side over and over again because they have no idea. No one ever taught them how to walk correctly, and now they're trying to do something different, and their body is not fluid with it yet. But no one else could realize that. Like, it doesn't look like they're actually walking like a penguin, but they just feel that way. And then eventually it gets to be more second nature. But the initial part's goofy, totally.
It really is. I don't think you knew I was in a boot for 8 weeks, 2020 summer, and I got out of the boot and I put a video on Facebook and Instagram, and my colleague, he messaged me. He's like, push off your toe, push off your toe. I'm like, I'm trying. It's so hard.
Get that first, second metatarsal going. Sure.
Like, I'm working on it.
Very nice.
We've kind of brushed past a little bit, but I know something big with you is when a lot of coaches are looking at movement patterns, it's like everyone's just focuses on like, what does a squat look like and how symmetrical is that, and what are the positions, and I know your big thing is like look past the squat and like looking at what else is going on with the body. And I know we kind of brushed past it as far as like you mentioned, like looking at the lunge and all these other things that we do throughout the day. Are there other, like, to help people like with a little bit more specifics, are there like other certain movements that you're typically looking at when you're assessing people to just kind of get a full idea of like how movement patterns are?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, don't get me wrong, the squat's really valuable. I look at everybody's squat, like like it's a go-to, but I think so many of us pigeonhole ourselves in that assessment, especially like you probably know this. Like, I saw all your, and congratulations on your NASM credential and all that kind of stuff, but like a lot of our certifications and licenses and that kind of stuff, like they preach assess the squat, assess the squat, assess the squat, and that's where most of the education goes. Now, they also will talk about some other, like maybe some single leg stance stuff, or maybe taking a look at like some shoulder rotator cuff ranges of motion. Like there's other things as well, but the squat's like kind of the end all be all that we prioritize. And as important as that is, it's not the only thing that we do throughout the day. And I would say for most people, it's not even the main thing that we do throughout the day. Like most people walk, and if you run, that's like a more exaggerated version of walking. And like and then obviously we don't move. Like unless I was picking up a heavy box, I can't remember the last time I went to pick something up with the perfect neutral squat. Like I'm always have one foot in front of the other, or I'm always bending at the waist or something like that. I'm never like doing a perfect squat. The only time I perfectly squat is sitting down to a chair and coming back up, basically, or exercising. But like, so to me, those other patterns are really important. So I always am looking at somebody's lunge. I want to see a split stance. I want to see how they're getting deep into kind of that kneeling position, if they're able to. Obviously, there's a caveat that if someone can't do it, if any of these positions cause them pain, then yeah, we stop. We like, this isn't an appropriate assessment for them right now. Still might be something that we got to work to improve on, but for right now, we're not touching anything that looks like a lunge. We're going to build toward it. But lunging is a really important thing. I want to see how they hip hinge. I want to see how they're deadlifting type thing, to take a look at how they're bending over the sink to wash their face, or bending over to pick up the groceries or whatever. I want to take a look at their upper body. I want to see how their thoracic rotation is looking like. I want to see their thoracic extension, their overhead position. I want to take a look at their shoulder girdles, and how they're moving in internal and external rotation on both sides. Like I think all of those are kind of staples. But then beyond that, I like to ask people, especially maybe not initially, but kind of like how you were talking about, if somebody's still having issues as they're going through the rehabilitation process with you, and you want to start being like, all right, let's think about what you're doing on a daily basis, where the root causes are coming from. Similar, after I kind of build up the foundation around some of these kind of staple movement patterns that we do in some way, shape, or form throughout our day, if that person is still dealing with kind of tweaks here and there, or like they're having ebbs and flows. Like some days they're going to feel good and some days they're not feeling so good. I want to get my eyes on the activity that they're doing. So like if they're always getting down on the ground because they got a toddler and they're getting all the way down on the ground, and every time they get up they feel that knee or they feel that back or whatever, then I'm going to have them get up and down. I want to see. I'm going to say, all right, I want to see 5 or 6 times you just get down on the ground and get back up. I want to see how you're doing it, and then notate how their body is moving and why that knee is talking to them each time. If they're a runner, obviously I want to see a video of them running, and I want to be able to look at them frame by frame from both front, back, and to the side, and see what the heck their body is doing from their ankles to their hips to their shoulders and neck. Like if they play a sport, like we have cricket players who are that are, are moving in all kinds of weird positions. And I'm like, all right, I want to see you pitch. Like, show me how you're bowling. I want to see how you're swinging that tennis racket. I want to see I want to see how your body actually moves, and see where the disconnect is, and then give them some cues that they can work on as like a dynamic warm up. Hey, this is what I want you to think about as you're doing a warm up. I want you to take a couple of swings and really be kind of controlled. Don't worry about where the ball goes. I just want you to worry about how your body is feeling right here, and practice this kind of motion. Well, that's going to be what stabilizes that knee correctly. So yeah, to me, it's actually taking a look at what the heck they're doing and giving them some feedback on it.
And I think too, it's really cool, and I'm sure you found this yourself, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as you start working with people in that manner, it's like they start figuring out this stuff for themselves, as far as like all of a sudden it's like, oh, when I'm doing this activity, my left leg rotates inward. Like, why is it like it shouldn't be doing that? Let's work on keeping it straight. And I think people are like start to develop more of awareness of like when those asymmetries are going on with their bodies too.
Yeah, 1,000%. I just had a client yesterday message us about like they were doing some yard work, and they were realizing every time they bend over to pick up the rake up the leaves, or pick out a weed or that kind of thing, they always are kneeling toward the left knee and always have the right leg forward. And they're like, this is another area where I'm always favoring that one side, and this is something that I do on a weekly basis. So like totally, I think that just educating people on some of the foundational pieces, they start to realize, oh, this is where I'm always favoring one side or the other. This is where that I notice that knee buckling in when it shouldn't be. Like Brienne's always telling me, like, don't let that knee go towards that big toe. And every time I do this activity, it does. Yeah, I totally agree. It becomes it becomes a self-correcting mechanism pretty quickly.
I'm curious about something, because like most things that we do, we can figure out how to correct our positioning so we're not constantly asymmetrical. What do you like for people who maybe drive for their jobs or commute an hour or two a day? Like one leg has to be forward when we're driving, unless you're on cruise control. Like that's just how it has to be. What are some like tips that you give some of those people, or do you have any for like what to do to help counteract that?
Yeah. So first and foremost, like I try to educate people on what's the lesser of evils. So like things like avoid bucket seats like the plague. Don't like, even though technically your right leg is going to be a little bit more extended than the left, you don't have to have your left knee fully bent with that left foot up against the seat while the right leg is turned out externally the whole time. Like it's teaching them how to get into as neutral of a position as possible, and also give them the grace of be like, look, I don't expect you to sit like an uptight race car driver this whole time, but like try to maintain that as long as you can, and give yourself permission that you're going to want to slouch to one side occasionally. You're not going to you're going to get lazy and that kind of stuff. But then when you realize it, get back on it, get back to neutral, do your best to get the body into as good of a position as it can. Then there's also things like, depending on the length of the car ride, if they're in the car and things start tightening up, I'll tell them like, hey, try to wake up a glute alternatively, like drive one heel into the floor of the car and squeeze that side's glute, and then relax it, and then go to the other side and then relax it. If they're the passenger, I'm like, hey, drop that seat back and go into some glute bridges, or bring your trigger point ball and release some the areas in your body. They're like, whatever is appropriate for the thing that they're doing. I have clients that send me videos while they're on an airplane, and they'll get up in the aisle and they'll do a movement break by busting out some lunges and squats just because they don't want to sit there forever. But beyond that, it's like, okay, we can only do so much, but to mitigate the tightnesses before or after that long car ride or whatever, like, here's your go-to dynamic stretches or go-to exercises to do as soon as you can. Like, if you're able to take 3 to 5 minutes, here is a dynamic hip flexor stretch here to open up that kinked hip that you've had that whole time. Here's a quick thoracic spine intercostal stretch. Here's a quick chest stretch to do, or neck stretch to do, or whatever it is, and just take 30 seconds, move in and out of that range of motion. Or if the person knows how to lunge correctly, or if they know how to squat or hip hinge correctly, I might say, hey, these 2 or 3 exercises, get out and do 5 to 10 reps of each of them. And just going through that, like, that's what I do. My wife and I are regularly going out to the Palm Springs region from us, which is a couple-hour car ride. And every time I get out of that car, I take 5 minutes, and I'm going through a 5-minute dynamic flow, and I just loosen up the hips and the shoulder girdle and thoracic spine again. And that goes an incredibly long way in offsetting the stuff that we have to do for our jobs, or have to do for certain activities or events that we got on the docket.
Awesome. Thank you for those tips. And yeah, I'm the same way with when I'm road tripping. I try to stop as little as possible, but when I do stop, I am doing the same thing. And then, yeah, when I get there, it's like I have my like 3 or 4 dynamic stretches that I do for like 5-10 minutes, just to loosen the hips up and loosen everything up from sitting for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I don't. Do you ever use any super bands to, like, or resistance bands to, like, aid in stretches to, like, pull the hip capsule open and that kind of stuff?
At times.
That's like, I can't leave my home without, like, I'm always bringing my big green band and a door anchor, and I'm always yanking open my hips in some dynamic stretch. I freaking love that thing. So yeah, that's my go-to.
Yeah, hips, I occasionally will. I use it more for my ankles. My right ankle had surgery on it years ago, and it still stiffens up on me. So I'll use it more for my ankle. But yeah, when I'm traveling, or especially to a competition, like, that's going along with me.
Totally. Nice.
So, well, Madison, this was a great conversation. If someone wants more information, if someone just wants to reach out to you for any reason, how can they find you?
Yeah, I think probably the easiest way is if they're on Facebook or Instagram. We're just at Health by Ratio, HEALTH, and then BY Ratio, RATIO. And or our website, you can go to healthbyratio.com, and all those, like, you can send direct messages. They go to my inbox directly, or on our website, we have a contact us form and that kind of stuff. So if anyone wants to check out any of the videos that we put out regularly on tips and tricks on how to release the body and exercise the body, correct it, even assess, like, I try to talk about how to self-assess and see where your own imbalances are and correct them and that kind of stuff, then yeah, the Facebook or Instagram platforms are great for that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This was a great conversation.
Truly my pleasure. Thanks, Brianne.